Welcome to the M&A Unplugged podcast. Our mission is to help you be better prepared for your business acquisition or sale. Being prepared will ensure you maximize returns and minimize risks. This is M&A Unplugged with your host, Domenic Rinaldi.
Welcome back. I'm Domenic Rinaldi, host of the M&A Unplugged podcast. Due diligence is fraught with all sorts of pitfalls for buyers. Today, I interview Joe Beer, who's the VP of Operations of our own firm, Sun Acquisitions. Joe has been with us for 8 years and been involved in over 200 closing transactions. Joe helps the parties during the diligence phase to deal with and manage through the inevitable speed bumps and keep the transaction moving towards a closing. As you can imagine, with that many deals under his belt, Joe has seen and done it all when it comes to diligence and closing a transaction. Today, we uncover the top 7 pitfalls that buyers face when conducting diligence. Whether you're a buyer or seller, you will want to hear this list and know how to avoid these common pitfalls. I promise you will walk away with an enhanced appreciation for what it takes to conduct diligence and consummate a transaction. You won't want to miss this episode. Before we get into the episode, however, we've created a best practices and checklist for how to conduct diligence. This is a free resource available on either of our websites, sunacquisitions.com or k2advisor.com. Take a minute to download this invaluable resource. It's a great starting point for you and your advisors when contemplating an acquisition. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hey, Joe, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Domenic. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so for those in the M&A Unplugged audience that don't know you and not familiar with you, you are the VP of Operations for our M&A firm, Sun Acquisitions. You've been with us 8 years, and you really have a critical role in our operation. You actually oversee every transaction once a buyer and a seller have agreed to an offer. You actually get involved before that, but in some of the negotiation and the LOI back and forth. But certainly once a deal is agreed to, you then take over the deal and you run point from that point until the deal either closes or dies. And fortunately for us, you're great at what you do, so we close most of our deals. And I'm curious, at this point in time, do you have a sense for how many deals you've been involved in?
Yeah, it's probably, I don't have the actual number, but I'd say it's, approximately probably over 200 at this point, probably over 200 deals.
Yeah, that's great. So lots of experience. You've seen and done it all across a broad range of industries. And, so I'm excited to get into today's topic, which is the top pitfalls. We actually came up with a list, you and I, of the top 7 pitfalls that buyers hit when they, look at doing diligence on a deal. And so I want to get into that and dive into these 7 pitfalls so we can help people at least get educated and hopefully, avoid making these mistakes. But before we do that, just a quick background here on yourself, so folks know a little bit more about your educational background and why maybe, you're a great fit for this role in our firm.
Sure. I'm a licensed attorney. I practiced for a little while before joining Sun Acquisitions. I always wanted to break into the M&A space, and sort of a non-traditional way for an attorney to do that. But I've been doing it for 8 years now for Sun, and it's been fantastic. Obviously, the attorney background helps a lot. I don't actually represent the buyer or the seller as an attorney, but having that background makes me, fluent in all the conversations around purchase agreements and, especially in the later stages of the deal when we're getting into some of the technicalities, really helps to have that training and background.
Yeah, and I think I'll also mention too, while this is not your formal training, you grew up with a dad who owned his own accounting firm. So
Yep.
Numbers are not lost on you either. So
Yep.
You bring sort of a numbers background along with your legal background, and it's a great mix for folks who need help during the diligence process and the closing process. And
Yeah.
Like you said, you're not anybody's attorney in the transaction, but you clearly represent one side or the other based on who our client is. So if we happen to represent the seller, you're representing the seller, or vice versa, the buyer, you're representing the buyer, but you facilitate that entire process between both parties. So it's important you have a relationship on both sides and rapport on both sides.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And following up on the numbers thing, I think I took every class that I could possibly take in law school to sort of catch up, including accounting for lawyers, which I sometimes refer to as accounting for dum-dums. So I did as much catching up and as I could in law school. I got my business law certificate there. So, I do have sort of both those backgrounds.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's great. Let's go ahead and dive in, though, to these pitfalls because, we've seen too many times buyers coming to the table with a deal in their hands and they just fall suspect to some of these challenges. Could have been avoided. And so we want to do our part to educate people. We've put this list together in no particular order, but I will say the first one on the list is probably the number one thing, which is the number one pitfall: people not choosing the right advisors, coming to the table and not having the right team behind them. So why don't we start off with, what are the right advisors? When we use that term in M&A terminology, what does that mean for people? And then how does that manifest itself in deals?
Sure. So you want to make sure, obviously, upfront, and this advice really applies to buyers and sellers, to be honest. So all the sellers listening out there can take note as well. But you want to have the right team assembled in advance, right? Well in advance of your planned acquisition mode. And what that means is, first and foremost, having a good accountant and having a good attorney. And, the term good is obviously quite generic, but in my mind, you can break it down relatively simply to someone who has experience in the sector, right? That understands closely held companies, how they're bought and sold, what finance documents look like. If there's real estate, they need to have commercial real estate experience, whether it's leasing or even if the property's up for sale, the owner occupied property. So you really want an attorney and an accountant who understands this market, how to look at closely held companies. And you also want someone that is, quite frankly, going to be responsive to you, right? They need to have the bandwidth. And in today's day and age, when everyone's taking on more and more projects, it's really important that whoever you choose understands that they're going to need to devote a portion of time to the deal, and to get it done quickly, because, as I'm sure you've said many times on the podcast, time kills deals. So moving diligently and swiftly in a sort of deliberate manner is crucially important.
Yeah. And so to put a bow on what you're talking about here, mergers and acquisitions experience from your attorney and your accountant is critical. They'll know the terminology. They'll understand what's happening in the current market, because things change, right? Yep. I mean, you see changes to representations and warranties over time and indemnifications, even right now, during COVID. If you don't have an attorney that is doing M&A deals, they're not going to be conversant in what's happening right now in this environment. And there's been significant changes to agreements given what's going on with, the pandemic. And so you need people that really understand mergers and acquisitions. And, Joe, I know there's probably a ton of examples, but, I think I won't cite the specific one, but I remember that a client came to us once and their attorney was going to be, a litigator, somebody who, really litigated and didn't spend a lot of time on M&A. Well, there's a couple of problems there, right? Number one, most litigators are in court every morning, and half their day is shot in court. And then the other half, they're scrambling to follow up on whatever happened in court. And so, M&A becomes, an afterthought, and those clients get lost in the mix. And, as we just stated, time kills deals. You need attorneys who are there and can respond very quickly. And that's not a knock against litigators. It's just that that may not be the best attorney for you to get an M&A transaction done.
Exactly. And honestly, in following up on that, the mentality is different. Litigation is a much different mentality than transactions are. And there's an inherent adversarial component to litigation. And I think often people that spend a lot of time in court, they let that mentality bleed into the M&A practice, right? And that can sort of create some real, stonewalls in getting deals done. If you're, the attorney's job is obviously to protect the client, but also to get a deal done. So, if you're overly protective in that sort of litigation mentality, it can cause the deal to suffer, stall, or even die.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully we got our point across there. And it really is. I mean, we could spend the whole show talking about, how to get the right advisors and why it's so important, because without the right advisors, you can make so many mistakes, actually buy a business that you had no business buying. Advisors will keep you from making really expensive mistakes that are hard to undo. So with that said, let's go on to pitfall number 2, which is, really failing to include all of the critical components in an LOI. And really, we always say, Joe, you and I and everybody in our firm, a really good diligence starts with having a great LOI that has, really, a lot of specifics in it, so the parties don't get lost and their attorneys and accountants don't get lost. So let's talk a bit about that. Well, when we say,
Sure.
Critical components, what do we mean by that?
So, there is a fine line between going overboard, obviously, having, getting bogged down, because the LOI is a framework. It's not, you're going to get to a purchase agreement phase, but you want to include enough detail that when you get to the purchase agreement, you're not stalled on issues that are sort of unresolved. So, it basically comes down to price and terms. Obviously, price and structure of the purchase price, how much is being paid up front? Is there a holdback? Is there a seller note? And, one thing that I see get a lot of people tripped up is the details around a holdback, or the details around maybe the seller's going to hold a promissory note after the fact, right? So that's one of the biggest hangups I see in these deals is, how long is, if there's a holdback, how much is it, how much money is being held back? How long is it being held back for? What kind of rights are there? If there's a seller note, is there a right of offset? How much is the note? Is there an interest rate? Is it secured? I mean, the list goes on. It's, and I find that around those, that's not necessarily price per se, but it's terms around the price. And it's easy to leave out any one of those aspects or get confused by them. Quite frankly, when you have when you have a seller note as an example, and, there's going to be a security interest, what does that mean? Is it a security against certain assets of the business? Are there outside assets that are being used to secure it? If there's a shortfall, are there any personal guarantees being signed? Who are they being signed by? So all of those components are critical, and I find that the later stages are you're caught up in details that maybe you could have negotiated up front.
Yeah, I could see that section that you were just going through, people going back and listening to that over and over, because there's a ton there. And by the way, if they think there's a ton there, there's a ton we didn't talk about. I mean, so this again goes back to, you have to have great advisors to get you through this. Dates was something that you didn't mention there, Joe, but let's talk a little bit about dates and how that plays into a really good LOI.
Yeah. So, for again, this kind of applies for both buyers and sellers, but you want to, even for buyers, you want to set out timelines, you want to set out dates so that expectations are properly set in advance. The worst thing that can happen is you set unrealistic dates, or you set no dates at all. And so you're sort of living in this no man's land of this deal, perpetuating on and on without any end in sight. So it's important not just to set a closing date so that your seller sees some light at the end of the tunnel, but that you set some dates in between there, so that when is financing supposed to be completed? How many days do you have to complete your due diligence? Things like that. You want to give yourself enough time, but you don't want it to be so egregiously long that you have a seller sort of sitting around waiting and getting anxious about whether the deal is going to close or not. Again, back to time kills deals. The quicker you can move, the more likely you are to reduce what we would call deal fatigue. And that's on both sides, right? The longer the deal drags out, you sort of lose that love between the parties they had when they first engaged one another. Right. And you're starting to see, a breakdown in the communication, the conversation, and, an issue that might have been nothing at all, right? In terms of confrontation, now at the end of, 60, 90, 120 days, however far you're out into the transaction, becomes sort of a bigger deal. You start to see the parties maybe digging their heels in where they otherwise wouldn't.
Deal fatigue, deal fatigue sets in, people get tired, and the littlest of things can set people off. And so you go back to the quality of the LOI can really ensure the success of the transaction. Don't overdo it, but make sure all the proper elements are in place so that you can get through diligence in an unencumbered way as quickly as possible, meeting the deadlines, and doing no harm to the business, because during discovery there's a lot that happens, and you want to get through it quickly so that the new owners can get into the business before any harm can happen to the business. So I think those are all tremendous points. All right, so Joe, let's move on to pitfall number 3, which is people not taking the right amount of time or the right approach to understanding the customer base. And so let's talk a bit about that and where the pitfalls are there.
Yeah. So when looking at the customer base, you're going to want to look at a few there's a lot of metrics, but some of the most critical metrics, right, are the customer satisfaction with the services or products being provided. If there's any concentrations, right, does 1 or 2 or 3 customers make up a very large percentage of the company's overall sales? And then you're going to want to look at things like retention and attrition over time. Are they adding new customers each year? Are they losing customers? And this is one thing buyers might sometimes shy away from, because sellers are naturally sort of protective of their customer names, right? And they want to make sure that they have if they don't have a serious buyer, they don't want to just be showing the the customer names to everyone. That's probably likely in most companies, one of their most valuable assets is their customer base, their customer list, their goodwill. So but that shouldn't deter buyers from getting the information. Obviously, you can get a lot of that information, especially with regard to concentration, retention, attrition, and things like that, just by filling in a customer ID number and sort of anonymizing the spreadsheet. So if you have a sophisticated enough seller, they're going to be able to provide those reports in a sort of redacted format, at least early on. As in the later stages of due diligence, when a buyer's sort of proven that they're committed to getting the deal done, maybe they have financing locked up and things like that, then you're going to probably get into that customer satisfaction realm. And with big firms and private equity firms, you see a lot of they hiring professional outside services firms to do anonymous customer surveys. It's so common nowadays to be getting emails or phone calls about customer satisfaction that I don't think a lot of people think twice about it. But it could be something as simple as a do-it-yourself online survey, right? You can create it, have the seller send it out from them, right? Not even from the buyer or even from a third party, but the seller send it out. And we've seen great results with those types of activities, where it can give the buyer assurance that there's no issues lurking around the corner, right. Or if there are issues, right, that they can be addressed maybe ahead of time and discussed with the seller as a sort of post-integration plan.
Yeah, I love this. I love this point. I love the tools that you mentioned, because, if you're a buyer, please understand that sellers don't want you talking to clients and signaling that there's a sale in process, right?
Yep.
Because if the deal doesn't go through, the seller wants to make sure they're maintaining their clients. And you also, as a buyer, don't want to let anybody, get a sense that maybe the business is going to be transacted, because those clients might start looking for another provider if they feel, uncomfortable. So the way to get around that is through, Joe, what you were just mentioning, these surveys, so that nobody has to know there's a transaction pending, but a buyer can still get comfortable that the client base is satisfied with the services and the products that they're receiving. And it's something that buyers don't do enough of and should be doing more of. And the last thing I'll mention about this category as far as clients go is what does it cost to acquire a client, a new client? And that's something that a lot of buyers don't dig into in diligence, but so important because you really need to understand how much money has to get spent marketing and sales to generate new clients. And if the cost of acquisition is really high, then you need to, really take a step back and understand what that model looks like for you. So these are all pitfalls, and buyers just don't spend enough time here, really digging in and understanding this piece.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go on to the next pitfall, which is, missing details or compliance issues. And, there's so much here. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, especially depending on what industry a particular business is in. So let's dive into what you mean by compliance and some of the details.
Yeah, so these are easy ones to miss, right? When you're entrenched in financial due diligence or getting lease assignments, working through a purchase agreement, and all the other and any sort of renegotiations. Really easy to miss some of these little details, but these are the little things like UCC searches, right? So you don't want to. Most people are doing UCC searches to see if there's any liens against the business, right? That could be private liens, that could be tax liens, that could be judgments against the business. So you want to make sure that you do a UCC search far enough in advance that if there were a lien to show up, that you have enough time to resolve it. We're dealing with a deal as we speak, right? Where a lien popped up and there was confusion over what assets were actually being secured, right, by that loan. And it turns out, they thought it was one host of assets and it wound up being another. And we lost like 2 weeks on it, not knowing. And so, if we had done the searches a little earlier, I should say, if, in that case, the bank or the person financing it had done a little earlier, we'd sort of have that in place. We would have been able to address it a little sooner. So that, that's one example. If the state you're in requires any sort of tax clearance, here in Illinois, it's called a bulk sales clearance, and it's required by the Illinois Department of Revenue, and for that matter, the Illinois Department of Employment Security. You want to get those tax clearances, just like the UCC searches, done well in advance. So in case, a lot of times there's a holdback needed where there's maybe some taxes owed, or some states do it where they make a projection based on how much tax they think would be owed, even if there is none owed. So you have to hold that back. So not only do you have to hold that money back, now you got to get an escrow agreement put together, determine who's going to be the escrow agent. It's, it's not as simple as just, okay, we'll set aside a pool of money. There's real administration involved in all that. So those are definitely, two of the bigger ones, but, you should also make sure, does the business need any license or permits in order to operate? Because again, that can take time. And even, with COVID going on right now, we've seen that can take even longer. Governments aren't working as quickly. And so we had a license in Chicago, actually, on a deal. It took months and months because it happened to be right at the height of all of this going on in March and April in 2020. And it was, just a very lengthy period of time. So, there's probably a million more I can mention, but
yeah, I mean, the two, Joe, that come to mind to me are unions and pensions and 401ks, right? I mean, sometimes the issues related to transferring those relationships over are so substantial, you could easily be adding 60, 90, 120 days to the process. So you want to get on those things very early in the process, as early as possible, so that it lines up with potentially when you're going to be closing the deal. And there's a, and there's a delicate point here, because you don't want to contact folks that do those things too early. Same time, you don't want to wait until the last minute, because then that could put the deal on pause. We've seen that happen. And when that happens, all sorts of bad things, you open the door to all sorts of bad things. The business could go into decline. A long time ago, we had a business that burnt to the ground because it came to a halt while all this work was going on, and there was no business to be sold. I mean, so, there are substantial things that could happen when you introduce delays like that. So you want to make sure you understand all those compliance issues and those details and you're addressing them at the appropriate time during diligence.
Yeah. And I mean, we don't have to go too far into it, but quite frankly, you have customer contracts or vendor contracts. You should be paying attention to what the requirements are. If there's assignability, if notice is required,
in fact,
and if so,
Joe,
how
I mean,
much.
you're getting into you're getting into our next pitfall, which is contract assignability, right?
Yes.
The fifth pitfall here around, understanding contracts. And let's talk a bit about why this is a pitfall for buyers and what they need to be thinking about.
Sure. Yeah. So unintentional segue there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, the when you're looking at situations where there's material customer contracts or vendor agreements, you want to look to see, there's a lot to look at, right, in these contracts. But the main thing, right, because the gating issue is, can the buyer take over this contract? Are they allowed to take over this contract? And what they need to look at specifically is whether it's assignable. And there's really three things. It could say you can't assign it without consent, and so you need to go get the consent. It could say it's freely assignable, which you get lucky, maybe once in a while get one of those, or it's silent on the matter, which attorneys might argue differently, but some would say that there's a presumption that you can assign it if it doesn't specifically prohibit it, though there's going to be some angst probably there and just making that assumption. So you really want to look at whether or not it's assignable, or what's required. If it is assignable, what's required, and how much notice do you need to give, right? Because you're going to need to back that into your closing date. If 30, 60, 90 days in advance are required to giving notice to this vendor or customer, you're looking at a lengthy period of time. So you want to be cognizant of those things as a buyer, and you want to make sure that you get copies of the customer contracts and vendor, the material, sort of the ones that matter, right? The material customer contracts and vendor agreements.
Yeah. And also understanding change of control, right? It might not even be assignability. There could be change of control clauses in a lot of these contracts that, even though they can be assigned, if there's a change of control, it triggers, a review or an approval process.
Yeah, absolutely. We just had one of these where there was a buyer that was very interested in, one of the main reasons they were purchasing the business was for a vendor relationship. It wasn't even a customer contact. It was actually a vendor relationship. And, we sort of stalled out a little bit at the end because, just so happened that the person that makes the decisions about whether or not this would be transferred was out on a sort of a health emergency. So, you want to basically have a plan in place to understand, even, go a step further. Who am I going to need to talk to, right, to get this transferred?
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right, we'll put a bow on that one and wrap it and go to the next one, pitfall number 6, which is, understanding the timelines to close and why that's so important. And buyers have been caught not paying attention to timelines, and all of a sudden, their deal is in jeopardy. So let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So we obviously touched on it with the LOI, right? You're going to want to create a nice roadmap and a timeline. But setting the expectations ahead of time and making sure that you don't, as a buyer, that you're not, for example, losing exclusivity if you've taken too long to get to the, whatever milestone, or even to get to the finish line, right? Most sophisticated sellers, if they have a good representative, are going to have some guardrails baked into the letter of intent that says that the buyer needs to be meeting certain milestones in order to maintain exclusivity, or in some instances, the exclusivity just expires, right? It doesn't go on ad infinitum. So, you have 60 days, you have 90 days. So it's really important that you set a realistic timeline in order to maintain exclusivity. And it's just, it's sort of the respectful thing to do, polite thing to do for your seller, right? You want to, if there's going to be delays, or if that financing is going to take longer in a particular instance, right, depending on how you're financing the deal, if you let your seller know those things up front, then when it actually happens, right, there's no surprises. They don't feel like you're trying to hide something from them.
Yeah, and I think it also highlights, timeframes are in there for a reason, right? They're in there to make sure that the deal moves at a healthy pace, right? Nobody wants to jam a deal through at the expense of somebody making a mistake. nobody wants the litigation after the fact. So everybody wants there to be a good transaction. But having a healthy pace really matters, because from a seller's perspective, if you as a buyer get into diligence and decide at some point that this isn't the right deal for you, they may have buyer number 2 and buyer number 3 in the mix. And being respectful of that is really important. The other thing that could happen is if you delay and miss targets, if you get to the point where your timeframes are up and now you have to ask for an extension, if you haven't been thoughtful about meeting those early dates, well, a seller might not be willing to do an extension, or even if they do an extension, they might not be willing to do it with exclusivity. And so now you've lost the exclusive right to do that deal. And so don't fall into that pitfall. Set realistic timeframes that you think you can hit, work along a decent timeline, get your advisors involved. And if hiccups happen and speed bumps happen, if you've built up goodwill, you can get extensions. But don't drag your feet early on. You could wind up losing the deal if any of those things lapse. All right, so here we are wrapping to number 7, and this is a big issue. It comes up time and time again where buyers either don't understand work in process and working capital needs, or they completely underestimate it, or they don't have the right advisors to help them really understand it. And so this is a big pitfall, understanding work in process and working capital needs. And so let's spend some time digging into that one, Joe.
Yeah, that's so. I mean, essentially, this comes down to what's included in the sale and whether or not it's going to be prorated, or if there's floors and sort of ceilings to this stuff. So when it comes to work in process, as an example, how are you going to look at the work in process, right? Are you going to prorate it based on a percentage of completion and have the buyer take it over from there? Does the seller get reimbursed just for their costs, right? They're going to have time and materials into some of these jobs where not every business has work in process, obviously, but the ones that do, the seller is going to, at the very least, expect to be reimbursed for their time, the time and materials they put into it already, right? Because it would sort of be a windfall to a buyer if that did not happen. Right. So, and that's not the only way to do it, right? You certainly can have instances where it's prorated based on a percentage of completion. And, you want to set that expectation up front. And going back to sort of the LOI stage, we see this one get missed time and time again, or willfully missed, quite frankly. Some people want to kick the can down the road. I've actually seen situations where we try to include it and someone, some attorney or even the buyer or seller strikes it out completely. And it's sort of a recipe for disaster, because you can be talking about real dollars here, depending on the nature of the business, and it can have a real swing in the overall enterprise value, being sold.
Yes, without a doubt. And it drives right into what's the working capital needs of that business on a go forward basis. And if you haven't contemplated walking into, the work in process, and you're going to leave that all on the table for the seller, then you have to have probably pretty substantial amount of working capital day one, which might not make sense. And so something that buyers just don't spend enough time with. And I will say that they also don't understand that in small businesses, many of the financial statements, and now we're going to talk largely about the balance sheets here, right? Because these aren't the internal statements. This is really balance sheet stuff.
Sure.
A lot of times they're not GAAP compliant and they're not reviewed. So these are, simply compiled by the seller, and it requires some real diligence, digging in and really understanding what's there. Does the seller take deposits for their product or service? Are they holding those deposits as a liability on the balance sheet properly? Like, all those sorts of things play into really understanding, what you're walking into and getting day one. And if you don't if you don't give this enough time and effort, Joe, your point about the actual purchase price of the business, might get inflated substantially if you missed this piece. So again, comes back to do a great LOI, get great advisors on your team, and you'll avoid a lot of these pitfalls.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we could, again, on this topic alone, it's so complicated. We could talk forever about working capital, what's included. Is there a target? Is there a post-closing adjustment? What does that look like? How much time do you need to do? I mean, you could go on and on. I mean, we really could do a whole podcast just about, prepaid working capital and work in process, because it's such a complicated issue. And I think a lot of people either underestimate it or, fail to account for it entirely in some ways.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, Joe, this has been great. This is an awesome list. This is not, I will say, these are not the only pitfalls. There's a laundry list of other pitfalls, but we wanted to bring out the top 7, the things that we see happen, very often. But there's still a ton more that need to be contemplated. As we wrap up, any closing thoughts that you would have?
My best closing thought is to, for buyers out there is to have a healthy degree of skepticism, but also a healthy degree of flexibility. No deal is perfect. And, while there's going to be pitfalls that you can't account for or don't know about, you can't catch them all. So, you try to minimize them as much as possible. But, I think some buyers might get stressed out that they have to go through unturn every stone or figure out every single thing. And it's just impossible. There's not enough time in the day to do that. So I think you have to balance some skepticism with some flexibility when you're performing your diligence, and focus on the things that really matter. Or it's going to be very challenging for you to get a deal done.
Yeah. Great point. Well, awesome discussion. Folks in the M&A Unplugged community, as I mentioned in my intro, we have developed a due diligence framework, best practices, and checklist. It's available on our websites. So please go ahead and download those checklists. I think it's so important to get those as a starting point. Joe, really appreciate you being here. This was a great conversation. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on, Dominic. Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. All of today's information will be available in the show notes. If you enjoy our content, please remember to subscribe and review our podcast. I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the M&A Unplugged podcast. And until then, please remember that scaling, acquiring, or selling a business takes time, preparation, and the proper knowledge.